if I can make a response, just from the perspective of thinking about the police response, because of course I was around at the time of Stephen Lawrence's murder, and I can remember that time. I can remember the reports on the news. I can't remember all the specifics around it. And I'm from Tottenham. I grew up in Tottenham, so maybe slightly geographically that little bit further away. But what I can remember is that when news kind of was breaking about institutional racism in the police force, it wasn't really a surprise as such, because I can remember growing up, and my brothers and my brothers' friends, they would almost have it was almost a badge of honor as to who had got roughed up in the back of a police van. It just was what it was, and they laughed about it, and so it just was the default way that things were, which obviously they shouldn't have been, but it was what we'd come to understand, to know, to recognize, and probably on a certain level accept, which we shouldn't have. And that's why we need to absolutely move forward.
I think context is so important. So South East London at that time was a hotbed of far-right extremism. From the late 70s, where you had the very famous Battle of Lewisham, when National Front tried to go through New Cross up to Lewisham, and they got their backsides beaten up and by anti-racist protesters, which was really actually an important moment in history for that anti-racism movement. And then, as you mentioned, we had the New Cross fire as well. And then as we moved into the 90s, the BNP and the National Front were really prominent in the area of South East London. So when you mix that with the recession, which was also going on in the 90s as well, you have to understand the social political kind of connotations which was going on, a lot of poverty, a lot of concern against the Conservative government at the point. You had this real blame game, which is often seen now, of what's the immigrants. It's there. So it's not much. It's nothing new, but who we're going to blame. And in that time, it was like, well, it's black and brown families who we're going to target. A lot of young people, and I think, I'm sure this won't be the last time we hear this term belonging. A lot of white kids were looking for a way to belong. That's not me saying, actually, we just take, we make excuses, but you could say there was a collective, we're going to come together and we're going to blame somebody, we can't get jobs, all this type of stuff. So that was the nature of what was going on across the country. But something quite sinister was happening in this part of London where black boys and women and girls were targets. And that played out also throughout politics as well. So yeah, it was a very dangerous time to be a black person in the early 90s.
I think you have to, in one sense, there's a history even before that. So, from the time when the Windrush generation started coming here, and even before, there were racist murders. I forget the gentleman's name, but in Notting Hill and so on and so on. So there was, there was all of that happening. And then you had in 1979, when the Thatcher government came in, and her giving her political broadcast and, being told this country is being swamped, a word that we use, it gets bandied around and we're being invaded and all of that kind of stuff. So that goes back. And then you had the 81 uprising in Brixton, Toxteth, etc. So that polarization between the African, Caribbean and Asian and other communities towards the black is a long-standing one. It's a long-standing, narrative, and this tells you the perspective. So in 1979, the National Front had a party political broadcast at that time, and my dad got all of us to watch it. That was it. It's like, you need to see this, you need to know this, you're going to sit, and it was scary. Seeing all these guys with Union Jack walking down the streets and seeing it on primetime TV, to the extent that even now when I see a large Union Jack, there's a dissonance there. I don't relate to it. There ain't no black in the Union Jack. So So there is this long-standing history coming to Stephen Lawrence. And then, of course, you know, the Institute of Racial Relations, they said, post-Stephen Lawrence, there's been 100+ racist murders. So yes, we've had the inquiry, all of that thing. And then you have it graphically portrayed with George Floyd's murder. So, you know, in terms of the trajectory, it's there going back many, many years. And then you take it back even further back in history, colonialism, slavery, etc. And it's all a sweep coming forward.
I think it's also important to talk about the police response as well. So obviously Stephen was murdered in 1993, but the response to his murder was also disgusting. So it's a case of, well, Stephen must have been a drug dealer, or Stephen must have been in a gang, or we're going to spend more time focusing on the Lawrence family as opposed to the perpetrators. And obviously that then leads eventually to the 1999 McPherson report, which then says, as we all know, that the police are institutionally racist. And then, if we go back to your original question, it's like, what has really changed? I mean, I think we could all probably mention multiple cases more recently in the UK context, where we will now more than ever, and this is what I find in a very peculiar ha-ha way, that, oh, okay, we're now saying that actually the police are, well, they're met with special measures, but black people have been saying for years that there's a problem with the police, and it's very interesting that whatever demographic you're now coming from, you're agreeing with that statement. So I think it's really interesting how history has kind of repeated itself and continues to play out with race relations with the police. It's a very strange time.
Yeah. But I think that you know that although there is still clearly something very wrong, you know, and there always has been something very wrong, I think things have changed. They are not where they need to be, but I do think they have changed, because just referring back to what I said earlier about what my brothers and their friends, you know, what their expectation was, you know, and what our default sort of, this is the way it is, you know, back then. I think, you know, now, I don't think black youngsters, black and ethnic minority youngsters would kind of, in the same way, expect to be roughed up in the back of a van, or just accept that it isn't the way that it should be.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Okay,
And the reason
okay.
I will give a real life example here of a young man that I mentor, and just for driving around, he stopped repeatedly and has been in situations recently where he's been roughed up in the back of a van. And it has traumatized him so much that, I'll give you a story from his life. He met this beautiful young lady, liked her, and then he found out that she was training to become a police officer. And just by finding that out, he broke it off.
Right.
Because of the traumatic experiences that scars his mind from interaction with police officers, that even somebody who he fancies and finds beautiful and could potentially go on and make a life with, it's a non-starter for him. And it's just that trauma. And I've seen him repeatedly, whenever he's on the streets, if a police car drives by, he's fidgety, not because he's guilty of anything, but because of experiences that he's had that has caused his body, his mind to react in a certain way. So I don't necessarily agree that the roughing up is not taking place.
And no, that's not what I'm saying. That wasn't what I was saying. And I think where I'd want to go with that, and probably I wasn't articulating myself properly, is that what was then an expectation, and it was almost kind of, it just is the way it is, and there was almost an acceptance, not that it's okay, but it's an acceptance that it is the way it is. And I think that what's changed now is that people don't just accept it. People will speak out about it. People are resisting. People are pushing back. That's what I think has changed.
I agree that people are pushing back a lot more, and probably more than maybe they would have done. But I think even just looking at the stop and search statistics around young black men will point towards a different picture and experience for them in UK in 2023, you know? And so I have two brothers, I'm sure they won't mind me saying this, phenomenal jobs, phenomenal degrees, both been stopped and searched by police. One, because he drives a nice car. Yeah, well, he drives a nice car because he's got a job. And so there's still this thinking around people, you know, who are black and brown, that you couldn't possibly do anything outside of crime to warrant you being able to afford a nice car, you know? And so if you ask most young black brown men, they have had experiences with the police that are really not great, not for any fault of their own, but that's the place that they've been in time and time again.
We have to just look at the stats, and the stats are that black people are 9 to 1 more likely to be stopped and searched. We say it flippantly, but that is a scary stat. 9 to 1. We have to look at recent cases such as the young man Chris Cabba, who was killed unlawfully. And that situation is not something which is a new thing. Black young people, but particularly young black boys, are in a situation where they will be stopped and searched and will be roughed up on a regular basis. And then when we talk about young black women, and we look at the situation with Child Q, and the way that young black women are, the term adultification, made to be looked and seen as older than they really are, particularly that was in a school context, we have to appreciate that. I think it hasn't got better. I just think the terminology has changed, and thank God for camera phones, because I just feel that we're seeing this stuff which we always knew was happening, but because of the technology we've got, it's going further, and I think it's important to acknowledge.